Ladies and gentlemen, Marlon Foster.
Am I the only one that grew up hearing phrases like, it's not what you know, but it's who you know? Growing up hearing phrases like, if you want me to show you your future, show me your friends, show me your social network. I grew up in a 3-generation home with grandparents there, with parents and first cousins being raised like sisters and brothers. And my grandparents would often say, always be kind to the mailman and the garbage man. They all happen to be men in my generation. And I wonder why they said that, but what they were really trying to communicate is that these two services had been given license, into social inclusion in our lives. They knew some of the two most basic things. They knew your health status and your economic status. They knew if there was insulin and what your medication was that would be left over in your garbage can. They knew if you had steak and potatoes the night before or sardines and crackers. They knew about your credit report because they knew if you got a lot of credit cards in the mail, maybe your credit was all right, but they also saw the bill with the red window and knew maybe things were a little tough. My grandparents were really trying to communicate was the power of social capital. There's a June 10, 2024 article by Margarita Petavea, and she lifts up in Britannica, 3 dimensions to social capital. She mentions they represent really, number one, this interconnected networks of relationships between individuals or groups. She talks about secondarily the levels of trust that characterize these groups. And thirdly, this power and influence that's both gained and brokered in these relationships. Social capital. When we look at social capital, we can attest that there are blessings, I might say, and benefits when it comes to social capital. If I listen to human resource professionals, they'll tell me that, if you really want your performance of your team to increase, you need to tap into the social capital of social cohesion among your team. If I listen to economists, they would say if you really want to increase your bottom line, you need to tap into trade associations in your industry and social groups to really get your money up. I'm a health and human service professional, so if I listen to social scientists, they say, well, if you really want to have a healthier community, what we really need is social participation through civic engagement and other elements. But we can also attest that there are some burdens when social capital is not exhibited right. Because for there to be insiders, there has to be outsiders. And that same favoritism and information and resources and assets that can be garnered within that group can be hoarded and monopolized to not make it outside of that group. And I might dare say the true cost of true social cohesion is actually the loss of self-identity and even your freedom. In my walk, I mentioned the president, and I've had an honor of shaking the hand of a local mayor, state governors, and U.S. presidents, but I've had the honor and pleasure of gaining my insight on social capital from 3 individuals that had nothing to do with those spaces. The first person was Stanley. And Stanley taught me, number one, that true social capital is earned by tipping early, even if not often. Ideally, you tip often, but Stanley taught me to tip early. You see, Stanley was a guy in the neighborhood, and I never knew who he was initially. I live, work, and worship in South Memphis now, and in this urban pocket in 38126 zip code, social capital and social cohesion has a lot of value, but I didn't know, my neighbors didn't know on 2 streets who every day was taking our garbage can down to the street. And we all would come out ready, but that person had already been there earlier, and every week, like clockwork, our cans were already rolled to the curb. And finally, one day I got up early enough and I met Stanley, who never asked for any money, never even said hello. We never knew who he was that was pulling everybody's cans to the street. Stanley and I became more and more connected from that point. We had this affinity for agriculture, but more specifically, he and I both had this strong hate of weeds. And through Stanley's social capital of sharing, Stanley ended up getting a part-time job out of my pocket because he was so pristine and his work ethic was so awesome. I was just amazed at how the team would come back the next morning and Stanley had those beds like you could eat off the dirt. 30 vacant lots and 4 abandoned buildings. People will talk about all of the resources that were generated, even millions of dollars in this urban farm. But what people may not realize that it was the efforts of Stanley late night when all the paid staff that were gone that really used his social capital to make it what it is today. The second lesson I learned was from a brother named CB. And CB taught me that your money has no value here. You see, I live in a home in South Memphis that was built 124 years ago. And for the last 40 years before my wife and I bought it, CB and his family lived in it. He and his brother had been taken in as foster children, and she raised them in this house. And CB, when we first met, it was through his mother, and she passed. And I felt this obligation to stay connected because CB had some mental challenges, and he was by himself and alone. And CB began to come by this house every day, and he and I both love coffee. CB and I would have coffee every morning together. And then when he found out to work down the street, he would come down there and we would have coffee. And then he would come back and we would make food. And CB would then eat from the table and maybe what we had the day before. And my children would see us going. And one day my youngest daughter said, no, I don't want to give CB the leftovers. I want him to have my plate. Which led to my wife then cooking enough food to make sure CB had a meal. And he was the only person that had carte blanche all over our house. And I preached a sermon about people who eat from your table but don't eat at your table. Wasn't thinking about CB when I preached that sermon, but a few days later when my wife came home, CB and I were sitting in the dining room, formal style, having a meal. CB taught me that there are some things that money can't buy, because one day when CB would always ask me for $1 for a cigarette, I tried to give him $5. CB pushed pause, said, no, man, I don't need all that. I only asked you for $1, and he would not take the $5. What I later realized he was really sharing with me is that the foundation of our relationship was not about money. It was about these cups of coffee and our conversation, and he taught me that money has no value here. The third relationship was with a brother named Jamal. Again, I live, work, and worship on the same street. The church is on this street. And all of a sudden, we have this group, Search Dog South, that's coming out, going to show children how they find people that may have drifted into, a wooded area down the street with dementia, or children that may have gone missing. And I'm prepping with Search Dog South, and we walk around the building, and lo and behold, the van window is burst. And I look inside, and all of a sudden I see these lamps that we were going to put up in the church. These chandeliers are missing, and these light fixtures. And I get excited, and I get a little angry, and I tell the church staff, look, can y'all track the scent of whoever broke in this van? They still tease me. Rev, you remember, man, you walked around with those white folks and those dogs, and you were going through the neighborhood. By the time we got a couple of blocks down the street, and I'm going with Search Dog South, and we're going to find out who broke into the church's bus. And when I get up to close to Macklemore by the car wash, all of a sudden this guy is walking down the sidewalk with these 2 light fixtures. I said, man, where'd you get those light fixtures? He said, no, man, I didn't steal these. I got these from Jamal. I said, well, who is Jamal? The word gets around the neighborhood. I'm looking for Jamal. Lo and behold, his family attends the church. Jamal finally comes one Wednesday night, and we've had Bible study, and Jamal comes up, and his relatives spot him, and he's asking him for a couple of dollars. He said, listen, I'm not going to give you anything unless you go apologize to the pastor for breaking in the bus. Jamal comes up to me, he said, Pastor, look, I just want to apologize to you, man. I was having a bad time. He said, if you want to call the police, go ahead and call the police. I'm going to stand right here. I'm not going to go anywhere. He said, but I just want to make it right with you. I said, no, man, I'm not going to call the police. I said, I tell you what, why don't you just come to Bible study with me? Just come hang out with me. Come to church sometime to visit. Jamal ended up coming to every noon Bible study. Jamal ended up coming to every Sunday service. But the challenge was Jamal had a heavy, strong stench about himself. So much so that when I was in the pulpit, my stomach began to turn. When Jamal sat on this side, can you imagine the whole church getting up and sitting on this side? It began to get so embarrassing. Folks were like, what are you going to do about this, pastor? You got to get this guy out of here. I said, no, he's welcome here. I mean, people bringing Lysol in their purse, and when the guy walked by, sprayed him. That's how strong it was. But Jamal taught me something. He was testing power over authority, because I was always taught that authority superseded power. I was taught, I gave examples. An 18-wheeler truck can be grinding down the highway, a semi-trailer truck, but it was a little fella on a motorcycle with a blue light that had authority that could make that 18-wheeler pull to the side of the road, because I thought authority always superseded power. But what Jamal taught me is that, power supersedes authority. I had the power to call the authority, but because of Jamal's vulnerability, I had to fall back. Jamal was teaching me to really live out the sermons that you preach or the songs that you sing, because I was being tested, the congregation was being tested, that because he had an odor, would you put him out of the fellowship? This went on for months, 6 months, 8 months. And finally, his family members who had ostracized him said, you know what, Pastor, if I clean out my tub real good, I think I'm going to let Jamal come on over and have a bath. Other members said, well, you know what? Now that Jamal, you're looking so good, I want to bring Jamal some clothes. And all of a sudden, when Jamal, through his vulnerability, began to be accepted, he began to take on some personal responsibility. And all of a sudden, there were no challenges with odor. About a year process. So Stanley taught me that to tip early and often. CB taught me that my money has no value here when it comes to social capital. And then when we got to Jamal, he taught me that it truly is power over authority. All three of these individuals were not like that mayor, that governor, or that U.S. president, because all three of them were on the spectrum from functioning mildly to severe mental illness. All three of them on their economic strata were from homelessness to maybe a rooming house here and there. They didn't have a lot of intellectual capital by the world standards. They didn't have a lot of economic capital by the world standards, but the social capital they had moved me greater than anything or anybody has before. I said these were friends that I once had, because within the last 5 years, we've lost all three of them. We had Jamal, who was missing for a few years, ended up finding out he was incarcerated. He got out of jail. The first place he came was to the church, and we got a chance to talk, and I was just riding through, and me and my wife stopped the car, and we hugged, and he was looking for me, and it wasn't even 2 weeks later that the community consensus is that Jamal was falsely accused of stealing a lawnmower, and a guy shot him dead. Stanley, he was on Chelsea Avenue with a part-time job at the scrap yard, and he had got his paycheck, and a strong wind stirred on Chelsea, and his check flew out of his hand, and Stanley stepped out off the sidewalk and got hit by a driver and died. CB on Lauderdale Avenue that was crossing the street at 5 a.m. in the morning, 5 a.m. while it was still slightly dark, and a driver hit him and killed him. And for Stanley and CB, both of those drivers never stopped. But that story doesn't end in tragedy, because with these lessons learned, I wanted to share them with you, because I've learned to tip early, and Stanley taught me that. So when I go to the restaurant, I give the tip on the front end before we even start, because I'm showing confidence, as Stanley did, is that the service is going to be all right. My wife and I go on vacation and go to the hotel. I don't wait till the last day. I tip the awesome staff. All I'm going to give them for the week as soon as I meet them. Stanley taught me that. When I'm dealing with staff at the organization, I give the promotion first and say, we'll put some money into your training and education, but I'm trusting that you're going to perform well. When it's time for raises, I say, let's not play games at the point of hire with a 90-day and a 6-month and 1 year. Let me give you the whole raise in the beginning, and I'm going to trust that you're going to perform. Stanley taught me to tip early, if not often. I mentioned that CB taught me that my money had no value here. And what I learned from CB is when I interact with politicians and business folks, I take money out of the equation. I never ask for money. Money sometimes come, but I hold on to my power like CB did, because he took money out of the equation of our relationship. One of the largest foundations in Memphis just gave Knowledge Trust the largest gift we've ever had, well over $1 million. But I served them for 15 years on their board and never asked for a penny. And in 25 years, I only asked them for money 3 times. And all 3 times, they gave me everything I asked for because I took money out of the relationship and took the power from that. And I learned that from CB. Jamal taught me the power of love and that my real power was in my willingness to be vulnerable. Jamal taught me that community is equated to the level of vulnerability that I'm willing to experience. I want you to take those 3 with you on today. Tip early, if not often. There are some relationships in true social capital where money has no power. And thirdly, real vulnerability and real power is exhibited in your ability to love. These 3 individuals, their story did not end in tragedy. Their social capital is most evident. Their value is most evident because even posthumously, they've made it to be featured at TED Talk Orange Mound.